Hello, and welcome to this presentation on the basics of existential approaches. I'm Dr. Crystal Brazier. So at its core, existential therapy is humanistic. Existential therapists tend to focus on holistic human experience rather than sort of primarily focusing on thoughts or behaviors or emotions or structures of consciousness. So as we think about existential approaches, let's begin with Ecclesiastes. So here are the words of the preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless. Meaningless, says the preacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. So the preacher, tried to find meaning in wisdom and knowledge, in stuff and riches, in work and advancement and pleasure, and it all fell short in the end. Searching for the meaning of life is one of the great existential questions and is foundational to this counseling approach. Okay, so of course, there are actually several different versions of existential therapies, and I'm lumping them all together here to provide an overview. It's a gross oversimplification, but at the heart of existential therapy is the human struggle between these three dialectics: aloneness with a corresponding need to connect with others, freedom with a corresponding need to take responsibility for the consequences of our choices, and death with a corresponding need to make meaning of life. And we'll talk about all three of these in more detail in a moment. Existentialists are humanistic in that they believe that people naturally tend to grow toward resolving these things in their own lives, which is like self-actualizing into a fully authentic person. And the formation of identity is essential for health, as is that drive to connect. Okay, so let's talk about aloneness. Aloneness is the first existential reality we're going to look at. So we're all born alone. We're going to die alone. However, in this life, we are pulled by a need to connect to others, to know and be known fully. It's not good for man to be alone, right? But experiences of rejection and abandonment can cause people to shy away from seeking out real connection. So there's some overlap here between existential therapy and attachment theory, right? Because of previous wounding, people can avoid connection, or they can become anxiously hyper-focused on connection. And both of these coping strategies can prevent real, vulnerable relationship. This dialectic between aloneness and the drive to connect is one of three existential realities that a person needs to resolve. So the second existential reality is freedom. Existentialists would assert that every person, regardless of their circumstances, enjoys some freedom. People who are enslaved can still choose whether to obey or disobey, for example. So Viktor Frankl, author of Man's Search for Meaning, a wonderful book, described how when he was living in Nazi concentration camps, he watched this freedom play itself out. So some of his fellow prisoners chose to keep fighting, to keep trying to stay alive, and others chose to give up hope and die. And even choosing the manner of one's death is in some ways an example of freedom. The context of one's thought life is another example of freedom. Most of us enjoy much more freedom than that, but freedom comes with a price. In order to act on our freedom, we have to make choices, and then we have to accept responsibility for the consequences of our choices. And often a choice for one thing automatically means a choice for not something else. Choosing always then demands sacrifice. And many people become stuck in fear of consequences, and so they eschew their existential right to freedom. They prefer that something external to themselves, like another person or life circumstances happening at them, take charge instead. And resolving this existential dilemma by rising up to make choices and accept the consequences of those choices is another important task. Okay, and then here is our third existential reality: death. Unless the Lord returns beforehand, all of us are going to die. But as the preacher character in Ecclesiastes shows us, we all must face the drive to make meaning of our lives. If we avoid the reality of death, we can also remain locked in a sort of like zombie existence in which we're not acting out of meaning and purpose. We're just sort of surviving another day, and we're going through the motions. And as Erik Erikson noted in his Psychosocial Stages of Development, if we reach the end of our lives without having reached a point of integrity that includes having acted toward a meaningful purpose, we risk facing death with despair. So that's the third existential dilemma that every person must face and somehow resolve in order to reach sort of full existential health. So then let's talk about how existential counselors view anxiety. Existentialists believe that people experience certain fears that can actually motivate them toward resolving existential conflicts. Fear of isolation, fear of meaninglessness, fear of death, fear of lacking meaningful relationships, fear of experiencing guilt, fear of emptiness. Existential anxiety is good. Anxiety is good and can lead to a fuller, more authentic existence if the person can find the courage to face these conflicts. Believing that there must be safety and security in life leads to short-term anxiety reduction, but it eventually inhibits a person from growth. So from an existential perspective, we're not trying to reduce or alleviate existential anxiety. We're trying to discover what growth the anxiety is trying to motivate. But on the other hand, existentialists believe that people experience neurotic anxiety as well. Neurotic anxiety is disproportionate based on the situation. It's overblown, and it's sometimes caused by repressed fears. It's sometimes caused by avoidance of existential anxiety. In other words, moving away from the existential crisis rather than courageously moving toward the existential crisis. So existential counselors differentiate between healthy existential anxiety that motivates a person toward action and unhealthy neurotic anxiety that occurs when a person ignores the message that the healthy anxiety is sending and they move away from the existential crisis rather than moving toward it with courage. So let's look at the therapeutic relationship in existential therapy. So Martin Buber gave us the concept of the I-thou versus the I-it relationship. In an I-it relationship, a person is relating to another as an overly simplified, more easily dismissed version. I-it relationships like viewing a person as if they're a cardboard cutout, a two-dimensional being rather than three-dimensional flesh and blood whole person who sometimes doesn't fit the mold that we're trying to cram them into. When I'm relating to another person from an I-it perspective, it's easier for me to block my empathy, to disregard or discount their experience, and to flippantly offer them advice. An I-thou relationship, on the other hand, is characterized by recognition of the other as an inherently valuable 3D person. The assumption is that although this person may not agree with me, their perspective has something to offer. I-thou relationship is connective, it's caring, it's curious. It accepts rather than seeking to withhold acceptance until the other person changes. The counselor in I-thou relationship works to understand the client's subjective experience. Existential therapy is mostly non-directive, with no direct attempts by the counselor to cause the client to change. However, existential counselors do point out alternative ways of being that the client might not have considered, and they do confront existential avoidance. Existential counselors in I-thou relationship engage in appropriate self-disclosure, modeling authentic I-thou relationship. And this requires that the existential counselor has courageously explored these existential issues for themselves first. A client's resistance is viewed in terms of being inauthentic. The client is seen to be avoiding existential crises or self-awareness or eschewing responsibility that they need to take for the freedom that they have. Okay, so let's talk about a few goals in existential therapy. So the counselor is working to help the client to do the following things: increase authenticity and honesty with themselves and others, find purpose and meaning in life, obviously, increase awareness about their choices, bring about a better understanding of self and personal values, improve communication and connection with others, and take responsibility for decisions and the consequences of those decisions. So remember that I've asserted before how critical it is to examine each counseling theory from a multicultural lens. Theorists from dominant cultural groups may have assumed that psychological health should be defined from their own worldview. So from a multicultural perspective, what do we think about existential therapy approaches? Well, one issue that some people have identified is that existential counselors might discount or dismiss a person's trauma history and suffering without truly taking into account the impact that it has had on a person's ability to rise up and take control of their own life. And I think that this is a potential risk of this approach, but only if a counselor steps into an I-it rather than an I-thou relationship. A counselor operating in an I-thou relationship would empathize with the client's suffering and affirm that that suffering may have had a lasting impact. They would still, I believe, continue to hold hope for the client's ability to heal and grow. So what cultural pros and cons do you recognize for existential therapy approaches? It's important to think these things through for yourself. All right, I want to thank you for taking the time to engage with these concepts from existential therapy approaches. As usual, I have to assert here, that this was an overly simplified sort of big picture review of these approaches. If you think this is the theoretical orientation that fits best for you, I want to encourage you to learn more about it, dive deeper. So read Viktor Frankl, read Irvin Yalom. These are two people whose work have greatly influenced this way of conducting therapy. And thank you so much.